Hello, and welcome back to another Half Pint session. Today, we have a return guest on the show, Peter S. Williams, and he is going to be discussing his new book, Behold the Man. Peter, welcome back to the show.
And thank you very much for having me again, David.
Not at all, not at all. So, new book's out. Where did this one come from and what's it about?
Yeah, well, this book is called Behold the Man, a phrase which some listeners may be familiar with from paintings of Pontius Pilate presenting Jesus to the crowd. That is the kind of reference there. The subtitle is Essays on the Historical Jesus, which kind of does what it says on the tin, as it were. And this is the last of a series of 4 books that I've been publishing with my publisher in the States, Width and Stock. Have been publishing these, a series of 4 books that are thematically collected essays on different topics. And I've been doing one a year for the last 4 years now. So we had one on apologetic method called Apologetics in 3D. We had one on arguments for God called A Universe from Someone. I had a book last year on intelligent design theory called An Informed Cosmos. And this year I come to works on the historical Jesus. And although these are collections primarily of kind of vamped up, polished up versions of previously published material, I've also been giving context to the thematic collections, particularly in the last 3 books. There's been kind of substantial introductory material that kind of gives a context, gives some of my kind of personal journey with that issue, my influences and so on. And this book similarly has an introductory chapter that kind of puts looking at the quest for the historical Jesus into the context of different worldviews and how they affect and interact with how you think critically about the quest for the historical Jesus.
And I'm interested in apologetics anyway. I have a very big shelf over there full of apologetics books. So I'm interested in this anyway. But specifically for Pints with Jack's viewers and listeners, you have some Lewisian content and Lewisian influence in this book. So would you mind just unpacking what some of those things are?
Yeah. Well, as a philosopher, apologist, I've long been influenced by Lewis. My parents, who were both teachers, had some C.S. Lewis books on the family bookshelf back in the day, and that was kind
Raised
of
right.
my introduction to kind of philosophical, apologetical thinking. And in terms of looking at worldviews, very much I remember Lewis's material about he would basically divide up the kind of worldview options into theism, naturalism, and pantheism. And there's varieties within that, but those are kind of the big 3 worldviews. And definitely his material on pantheism and on naturalism are an influence upon my analysis in this book. I quote him on the difficulties that pantheism has dealing with, if you think that moral values, objective moral values are real things, and that some things are good and some things are not good, some things are bad, are evil. And that is a difficulty for a worldview that would say everything is one. And ultimately, there's really no distinction between things, that everything is God. Well, that means everything good and evil, and kind of how do you cope with that? And then Lewis himself, interestingly, only the other day I was giving a lecture to some students from my college in Norway about how Lewis, as an atheist, very influenced by the kind of materialist, naturalist worldview of thinkers like Bertrand Russell, argued himself out of that naturalistic perspective whilst still being an atheist. So uh, before he came to believing in God, let alone Christianity, Lewis had argued himself out of the kind of scientistic, materialistic worldview of the likes of Bertrand Russell, which these days will be familiar to many people in its repackaged form from the new atheists like Richard Dawkins and Alex Rosenberg and so on. So um, there is definitely a kind of influence on the worldview analysis that's going on in the kind of setup chapter there. And then also I discuss the kind of cumulative case that one might make for a Christian understanding of the historical Jesus. And I unpack the elements here into the worldview that you can bring to the table and how that interacts with what's going on here, your kind of worldview assumptions, but also your thinking about establishing how do we establish what counts as relevant good evidence that we need to take into account, and how do we explain that evidence. And I sketch out a kind of cumulative historical case, evidential case for a Christian understanding of the historical Jesus, and in that draw particularly on what sometimes come to be known as the mad, bad, or God argument, or the lunatic, liar, Lord argument, which is something that Lewis used at a popular level. But as with much of Lewis's kind of deliberately popular level apologetics, has been influential and drawn upon by later generations of Christian philosophers and apologists, kind of refining that material and that approach. So I quote, for example, Stephen T. Davis, Christian philosopher, who defends a version of the mad, bad, or God argument, as he calls it. And I phrase the argument not as a knockdown proof of the divinity of Jesus, but as part of the evidential cumulative case that has at least some weight to it, as part of this cumulative case. And so that kind of links in with one of the essays in the book is a revised version of an essay I published on looking at high Christology, or a kind of view of Jesus as divine with a capital D, if you like, in the Epistle of James in the New Testament. Because when you're looking at the kind of first premise of the mad, bad, or God argument, it has to be that we've got good reason to think that Jesus had a kind of divine, in a Jewish sense, self-image. And you can get at that through kind of direct evidence of reports about what Jesus said and did and how those reflect his self-image. But there's also an indirect argument about what his initial followers believed about him, and how do you best explain how they would come to adopt that view of Jesus, particularly given their Jewish monotheism of the day, right? So I look in James and argue that the letter of James, whoever it was written by, and I do think
there are lots of Jameses,
lots of James, but I do think it was written by James, the brother of Jesus. But whoever it was written by, it's certainly a very Jewish milieu kind of book, a very Jewish atmosphere to that letter. And there's really good reason to think that it dates from before the Jewish War of about 66 AD, and some evidence to think that it dates back as early as the mid-40s AD. And if you can show that Jewish atmosphere letter in the mid-40s had a high Christology, and it's written to Jewish Christian diaspora who must have already themselves had that idea of Jesus. That idea of Jesus must already have spread around the Greco-Roman world, and therefore must predate the letter. I think we've got good reason to show that the existence of a high Christology within 15 years of the crucifixion. So that's a kind of interesting indirect route argument in favor of the first premise of the kind of Lewisian lunatic, liar, Lord argument.
and I do love that, because whenever I've ever heard the liar lunatic Lord presented, people always go to the Gospels because it's Jesus' words about himself.
Yeah.
But I really like the fact that you then bolster that by looking at, of all books, I don't think I've ever heard anybody go to the Epistle of James, apart from yourself, when bringing this argument, but to go for, as you say, a very Jewish letter and to prove a high Christology early, because normally everyone goes to Corinthians when Paul talked about what he himself received, and that can be dated back super early. But
Yeah, yeah.
to take that same route with a completely different letter was really quite wonderful. So hopefully people can see these are all Lewisian ideas and things that he touched on, but then bolstered with modern scholarship and the apologetics that have happened since Lewis gave those radio talks on the BBC.
Yeah, that's a very good way of kind of describing the inspiration for the book here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I just want to go back to the earlier division because, the earlier division about you can divide the world into basically naturalism, theism, and pantheism. I remember when we had our Mere Christianity book club when we were in San Diego, quite a few people asked why that particular pantheism seemed an odd choice for the third option, possibly because most people in the West don't really deal with pantheists in general, and certainly not in more recent years. So, would you mind just unpacking that a little bit more? Why does Lewis choose those distinctions, and why you agree with him?
Right. I mean, we may not come across pantheists so often in our cultural contexts, but of course, it's a major worldview within other parts of the world and a major historical world view. And of course, there are various types and overlaps, and you can get into the distinction between kind of pantheism and panentheism as well. But if you're starting with kind of basic worldview options of kind of what is the fundamental nature of reality, is there a mind-independent material world, natural world, or not? Right. The view that says there's not, that there is only supernatural, or it's funny to describe it in that way, in a view that says there isn't any natural, right? This is using kind of Western categories. There is only a spiritual or mental reality. And the worldview, the major dominant worldview there is a worldview that would identify that non-material reality, the only reality, with God, but God in an impersonal sense, not a God with wants and intentions and purposes and so on. So it's a very different view of God, but it's a view that says there is one fundamental reality, and there is no mind-independent material reality. The appearance that there is such a thing, indeed the appearance that there is a distinction between you and me, is an illusion, because fundamentally there is only the one, and that is then identified with God. But again, we shouldn't think of that God in kind of Western terms, or Middle Eastern, if you like, terms about what that God is, because of course the Western condition comes from the Judeo-Christian and then Islamic traditions of a personal God who created a world which genuinely has mind-independent existence, which is not to be identified with God, although God created it and is immanent within it as well as transcendent beyond it. So the naturalists, the kind of standard Western type atheism, if you like, is the view that says, no, there is no spiritual reality. The material world is all that there is. The theists will say, well, there is a material world, but it's created by a personal God. The pantheists say, well, there isn't a material world. It is God, but it's not personal. And so, you can divide this along the lines of the questions of, is there a material world or not? The question of, is the fundamental reality personal or not,
Yeah.
and then work out the kind of Venn diagrams from there, as it were. Yeah,
Yes. With theism being that intersecting between those two
yeah,
circles.
yeah.
Well, you covered some of the Lewisian stuff. You mind just talking a little bit about some of the other things that people will learn about and things that you discuss in the book? I do want to point out it's very nice. It has pictures, which I like, and also lots of little diagrams when you're explaining something. So this is how my mind works. If
Mm-hmm.
you're explaining a concept, I would like a Visio diagram, please. So
Mm.
I just wanted to point that out before I forgot. But what are some non-Lewisian areas that you tackle in here?
Well, it's a fairly eclectic collection, which is why I spent quite a lot of time putting this new chapter in at the beginning to give the context.
Mm.
Those worldviews that we've talked about, and then I work through the distinction between what's called kind of pre-modern worldviews, which would include the theistic and pantheistic views, the modernist worldview, very much that kind of Bertrand Russell view that C.S. Lewis had when he was an atheist, but then looking at postmodernism, and indeed now what's arisen in the last kind of 20 years, a movement called meta-modernism, which is a kind of secular movement that is frustrated with the failings of modernism and postmodernism as worldviews, particularly their failure to kind of fit our lived experience as human beings and the things that really matter to us, that we at least pursue to make life worthwhile and so on, that we are very concerned with the mind, with experience, with morality, with meaning, and so on. And these are things that the modernist and postmodernist worldviews do a really poor job of kind of giving a home to. And this movement is therefore frustrated with those worldviews, wants to move beyond them, but is deeply reticent about moving back to a religious worldview, because they would buy into a lot of the kind of Enlightenment critiques of religious worldviews, often kind of historically incorrect critiques of religious worldviews and so on, and are left kind of admittedly kind of they describe it sometimes as oscillating between or trying to braid the modernist and postmodernist perspectives,
Or having your cake and eating it too.
yes, basically. I think I don't think they've managed to come up with a positive, coherent alternative to the modernism and the postmodernism that they desperately desire to move beyond, but also actually seem to be committed to the fundamental secular worldview tenets of. And so they are in a very tantalizing position, to draw upon a Greek mythological metaphor there. And so I think there's lots that's positive about the meta-modern movement when they're critiquing the failures of modernism and of postmodernism. But there's also things to criticize in terms of when they try and put forward a positive alternative. I don't think they manage to coherently do that. My heart longs for them because they're crying out for things that it seems obvious to me that a theistic worldview can give a coherent home for, and a coherent, reasonable explanation for. I quote a Scottish philosopher called Jonathan Rowson, who talks about the way in which the Enlightenment worldview severed the truth, in scientific terms, from the good and the beautiful. And that he would love to find a worldview that could put together and put at the heart of it truth and goodness and beauty. And it so much puts me in mind of Lewis, who says that under the influence of the kind of Russellian worldview that he used to hold, everything that he thought was sort of meaningful to him, he thought was untrue. An illusion, and everything that he thought was true, he thought was meaningless, factually speaking. And the great thing about Lewis, the thing I think I learned deeply from Lewis, both from his apologetics and from his kind of fictional, his literature works, was this integrated, holistic worldview where truth and goodness and beauty and theism go hand in hand and are kind of inseparable from one another. And I really want to kind of say to the metamodernists who may read or hear of this book that I see you are desiring these things, and the secular roots of your worldview cannot coherently give them to you, but theism can. But that, and don't be frightened of that. That doesn't mean that if you consider theism seriously, you also have to buy into the patriarchy and so on and so forth, and thinking that science is a bad thing or what have you. A lot of these critiques, which are the same kind of critiques that the new atheists make, that go back to the kind of Enlightenment era, are really unnecessary misunderstandings or unnecessary components of a contemporary pre-modern worldview, if you want to put it like that. A contemporary pre-modernism doesn't mean turning back the clock in a bad way. But again, as Lewis said, if you've got to a dead end, the only sensible thing to do, in a sense, is to turn back the clock and go back and start over again from a more sensible starting point.
Go back to where you made the mistake.
Oh.
I am reminded of the line in Mere Christianity where Lewis talks about the long, terrible story of our attempt to find something other than God to make us happy. Because when you're describing metamodernism, there's the environment reminded me actually of, say, like the Romantics, which Lewis was very much into at the time, which was also trying to seek a kind of religious transcendence without the religion.
Yeah.
There's something in the human heart which longs for something transcendent, which is Lewis's own argument from desire. So it does seem just the latest iteration of a repackaging of realizing the logical and meaning-related consequences of a purely naturalistic world, not liking those consequences, and trying to find some basis, some grounding to retain the thing that religion naturally implies regarding free choice, meaning, purpose, all these other things, to try and retain those things, but to try and get it out of a grounding that doesn't require a God.
Yeah. And I think, again, a positive thing about this movement is that because of its critique of postmodernism, saying, postmodernism is great at tearing things down, but is terrible at giving you a foundation for building anything on. Mm-hmm. Whether that's an individual or communal life, whether it's a global response to the ecological crisis or whatever, postmodernism is not where it's at, right? But because of that critique of postmodernism, there is a kind of renewed emphasis on the value of truth, on the value of evidence, and that is where I think combining that with a kind of worldview critique that will make a theistic worldview at least a plausible option on the table when you are considering what the evidence is and how best to explain it, that you won't just beg the question against a Christian interpretation of the historical Jesus, but that you will be freer to let the evidence speak for itself and kind of lead you where it points.
Beautiful stuff. Peter S. Williams, thank you for coming on the show. Where can people get Behold the Man, and where can they find out more about you?
Well, you can, of course, get Behold the Man direct from the publisher, Whip and Stark, or from online bookstores such as Amazon, or order it from your local physical bookstore. That would be great. There's a page all about the book, together with lots of free resources as well, podcasts and videos and things on my website, which you can find at Peter S. S for Stephen, peterswilliams.com, and then just go to the books, the publications section, and find the Behold the Man page.
Wonderful. Now, Behold the Man comes from the words of Pilate, which he obviously spoke in Latin, ecce homo. So I would just like to end with a little thing that I found out about a decade ago, and I thought it was hilarious and telling. One of Pilate's famous questions is, what is truth? Or in Latin, quid est veritas? And it's actually an anagram in Latin for est vir qui ad est, which means it is the man who is here, Jesus Christ. And so with that, thank you, Peter, for coming on the show again, and thank you all for joining us, and please join us again next time when we'll continue going further and further in. Cheers.